Hello, everyone. Welcome to Today with Totally Out Now. I'm Ragolga de Silva, or Totally Out Now. Today, our topic of discussion is same sex relationships. Let me start. So, I came out last year when I turned 50. I kept looking for information online. I asked my friends around for years to find stories and literature on same sex relationships. Often, I would be directed to Kama Sutra, mythology, but no one really gave me any information about same-sex relationships. Even amongst the voices we have in the community, the same information is typically disseminated and rehashed. Until I came across Dr. Ruth Vanita's work, my life literally changed. My eyes opened to a world that I knew existed, but really I knew nothing about. Let me share a bit more about Dr. Ruth Vanita. Ruth taught at Delhi University for 20 years and is now professor at the University of Montana. She was the founding co-editor of Manushi from 1978 to 1990. She is an author of several books, including Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage in India, Memory of Light, Gender, Sex and the City, Dancing with the Nation, Courtesans in Bombay Cinema. She's a co-editor of Same-Sex Love in India, a literary history, and has translated many works of fiction and poetry from Hindi and Urdu to English. I'm so fascinated by all this. So welcome to Today with Totally Out Now.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to see you, and thank you for making the time. And I just thought, let's start with your book, Memory of Light. The setting is pre-colonial, and it's about love between two courtesans, Chapla Bai and Nafis Bai. It is your first book of fiction, I believe, set in the 18th century Awadh. And now that's very interesting. So what prompted you to set this love story in Awadh?
It's a novel that was published by Penguin last year. It's a historical romance in which, as you said, the two main characters are two women. One is a dancer, one is a poet. Both are courtesans, all live in courtesan households. And there are also many other characters. Some real-life historical male poets are their friends and are characters. Why did I set it at that time? It's late 18th century to early 19th century Awadh, because my earlier book, Gender, Sex and the City, was about the Urdu poetry from this period. And I learned Urdu, in fact, to read that poetry, which is amazing poetry, and which I translated a lot of that poetry in Gender, Sex and the City. And I also quote that poetry and weave it into the novel. And the interesting thing, now Urdu poetry, as I guess most people know, has a lot of poetry between men, love poetry between men. Almost, it was a convention. Almost every poet wrote that. But what is unique or special about one kind of Urdu poetry written in Lucknow mostly at this time, also in Hyderabad, there was a poet there too, but mostly in Lucknow, is that it depicts love between women and all the ups and downs of that romantic, funny, humorous, playful, sad, all the range. It's astonishing poetry, and it's very clear that these are sexual relationships. Also, in the prose written by these writers, they describe rituals performed by women, between women, exchanging food items and so on, and which they perform to form couples. So the two women who perform this ritual together are couples. And there's a whole number of terms for a woman's female intimate, who may be a close friend or a lover. Words like dogana, zanaki, which all have very interesting meanings, ilaiti and so on. And one of these descriptions, which is the most interesting, by poet Saadat Yar Khan Rangeen, I should mention that all the poets I study are Muslim men. One of the descriptions is of two women who perform a particular ritual, and he says this is marriage. They marry each other among their female companions. So it suggests, he doesn't state this, that even if the women are married to men in the society, among their female companions, they are married to each other. This is so. And of course, men at the time were not required to be monogamous. They might have been, but they're not required to be. They could have relations with courtesans, with men outside of marriage, as long as they married and produced children, which most of them, not all of them, did. So it's a fascinating world, and I was really, my imagination was steeped in that world, having read a lot of that poetry and written and translated it. So, and then I also had a love story to tell, which is a love story that could have been set in any period. But then the two things sort of came together and melded, and that's why it's set in that period.
How amazing. When I was reading your book and it felt like during pre-colonial times, the society was so modern. We were more accepted, right? Like you said, and men could have relationships with other men, women could have relationships with other women. But so when did this turn? Modern homophobia that we face these days, when did that change?
Of course, when you're talking about a huge country like India, subcontinent at the time, and over thousands of years, one can't generalize to say that it was always accepted everywhere in the same way. We only have the written record, and from that we can see what one can say is what was not there. And one can say, for instance, that nobody, as far as we can see, was executed for same sex relations, which happened constantly in Europe up to the early 19th century. At least from Henry VIII's time up to the early 19th century, many people were executed. That never happened in India, as far as we know. The first and only execution that I know of occurred in 16th century Goa, when the Portuguese had imported the Inquisition, and they burnt alive a 16-year-old boy for so-called sodomy. That's, yeah. Also, what we know from the record from same-sex love in India, this is when I began this research, is that in Europe, it was called, same-sex relations were called the sin not to be named among Christians. It was unspeakable. You've heard the phrase, the love that dare not speak its name. That phrase is invented by Alfred Douglas, Oscar Wilde's lover. And that was never the case in India. It was never unspeakable. So right from the Kama Sutra, which has a whole chapter on desire between men and goes into very interesting details. Now, in that Kama Sutra, right from the Kama Sutra to the Urdu poetry I was talking about, and a lot in between, there were a range of depictions of same-sex relations and a range of attitudes to it. So, in the Kama Sutra, the putative author, who's Vatsyayana, the sage Vatsyayana, says that some people don't approve of this, and he cites a lot of names, and those works have vanished, but he cites people who are disapproved and who have different opinions, and he says his own opinion is that one should consider the customs, the society, one's own feelings and predilections, the situation, and then decide what to do or not to do. And of course, the last line of that chapter, which I really love, is who does what, where, and when, who knows, which is a very good point, because who really knows who is doing what? Even within a male-female marriage, we don't know what they are doing, whether they are doing anything or what. So sexual, basically saying that sex cannot be monitored. Who knows what, who does what, and when and where. I also found 14th century texts produced in Bengal, which show two widows having a child together. They have a sexual relationship and they fall in love, and this is a divinely blessed and planned arrangement. They are not aware of that. And they produce a child who is a very famous hero, Bhagiratha, who goes on to, that's a well-known name in India, Bhagiratha. Now, these stories are only found in Bengal so far, who knows, but in the rest of the country, the story is told differently, not in this way. So there's a range of writing about it, but the point is it was never unspeakable until the post-1857 period, when the British crushed the Indian revolt in 1857 and took over the administration formally. Then they basically attacked Indian cultures, Hindu, Muslim, all kinds. The princes, they took over the education system pretty much. Gradually, they took over administration. They brought, of course, and the symbol of this is the law that they brought, the anti-sodomy law in 1861, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which interestingly does not make it illegal to be what we call gay. It's not about identity. It's not about relationships. It doesn't say that two people of the same sex can't live together or even can't marry. It doesn't. It's only about certain sex acts, penetrative sex acts. So it really doesn't apply to women, and it only applies to those. And again, there were very few convictions under this law, because how do you know who does what, where, and when and why? You can't prove that two people did a certain sex act. Usually, you can't prove. But though there were very few convictions, most people had not read the law, including the police, and most of them thought that the law prohibits same-sex relations altogether, all relationships. And so the police used this to threaten and harass, especially men who were often looking for each other in public spaces, and occasionally even women, the female couples who ran away together. They often used it wrongly to threaten them, though no women were ever convicted under this law. I guess the worst case one can think of in recent times under this law is that of Professor Ramchandra Siras, who was a professor of Marathi and a poet at Aligarh Muslim University. And in 2010, a journalist illegally burst into his bedroom, into his house, which is absolutely illegal, and videotaped him with his lover. And the university then suspended him, which they had no business doing. And then he was basically hounded to death. He died under mysterious circumstances, though the gay activist did come to his support. His reputation was destroyed. His life, he was a very quiet man. His life was destroyed, and he basically was hounded to death. So anyway, Section 377 was overturned in 2018 by the Indian Supreme Court. But yes, I would say with the coming of, what happened was that the Indian leadership, Indian leaders, Hindu, Muslim, and all kinds, once their own culture was kind of attacked, and they felt that they have lost the battle against the British after 1857, they kind of changed themselves and felt that to fight the British, they have to become like the British. They have to turn themselves into Victorian gentlemen and later Victorian ladies. And so they basically they denigrated all their earlier literature and culture that was anything that was not fitting the Victorian British and Christian model. Not just same-sex love, but also courtesans, also polygamy, all kinds of arrangements that they denigrated. And they kind of tried to rewrite history by saying, oh, we were always heterosexual and monogamous. And they hid away a lot of the Urdu poetry I was talking about. I had to go to libraries and archives and copy it out by hand. It was not available in print at the time, because they basically declared all that poetry obscene and hid it away. It said one Urdu critic famously said that it makes men effeminate and women immoral, this kind of poetry. So they hid it away and made it inaccessible. It disappeared from the canon, and so on. And this is across the board, from left to right, nationalists, from Gandhi to the communists. Everybody sort of saw took on the European view of homosexuality as the dominant view, I should say, of homosexuality as unnatural, abnormal, a sickness, and so on. And I often say that in 100 years, there was a complete turnaround, which one can see from the poetry. In the 1820s, these Urdu poets who are famous, major, popular poets, are openly writing about male-male and female-female relations, and also about male-female relations in the same tone. But when you get to the 1920s, as a Hindi writer whose work I translated called Chocolate, Ugra is his name, and he published stories on homosexuality. He was attacking homosexuality, but he published these stories, and everybody attacked him and said, never write about this. It is not to be mentioned in polite society, which is, so it had become unspeakable in 100 years. And I should say that the British, not all the British viewed homosexuality as unnatural. Many of them themselves inclined towards it. And in the 18th century, when many Europeans came to India, they were astonished to find the range of arrangements, which were sexual arrangements, courtesans, and many of them enjoyed it and were very happy. But I often give the example of Lord Byron, who in the 1820s had to change the pronouns in the poetry that he wrote to men. Whereas in India, at exactly the same time, Insha, Rangeen, Jurrat, all these poets were writing this poetry openly about men and about women, everything. That's the difference. So it was a very huge difference between the cultures at that time. Now, ironically, by the 20th century, ironically, there was another complete change. By the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was much more accepted in Europe and America than it was in India. Many Indians then were under the false impression that homosexuality was an import from the West, whereas in fact it was modern homophobia that was the import from the West. But most Indians, in Western educated Indians, don't read their own literature, barely read it, I should say, hardly read it. And we're not aware of it. Yeah,
we're not aware. That's the word. Because what I'm hearing is that it was slowly, gradually, somehow we kind of got brainwashed, isn't it? And there is so much of social stigma attached to it. You know, that's the word you use, sin. I'm a Catholic. My God, in my house, even leaving your marriage is a sin. Then being with the same gender, it's not heard of. I'm going to be burning in hell for the rest of my life. That's what I've been told. So this happened gradually. But I just wonder that how did we in India didn't understand the Section 377? How did we allow for it to happen in the first place, and so gradually? We have the numbers. We could have opposed it, right? But we didn't. How did we allow that to happen?
Well, the British had imposed it, and it was on the books. There are many other laws, I should say, which the British have imposed, which are still on the books. They've never been examined again or looked at again. And then Indian attitudes changed. So many Indians felt, yes, this is against our culture, and still feel this is against our culture. And 377 is very good because it is preventing something unnatural and abnormal. So you know that the Supreme Court went through first they abolished it, then they reinstated it, then they abolished it. So the struggle went on for many years to change the law. I should say that the British brought this law to all the countries, including the US, that they colonized. And it was overturned in the US fairly recently, 2012, I think it was, so not that long ago. And of the Asian countries, India, a few have overturned it, but many have not. It's still there in Malaysia and Singapore and Pakistan. Pakistan has even
Yeah.
more severe laws. But yeah, it's still there in most of the countries. So India has at least abolished it. I should say, when you say brainwashing, I'm not sure it's only brainwashing, because a lot of these leaders consciously decided to adopt, not just on this question, but on many questions, decided to adopt European ways of thinking. Even though they were Hindus and Muslims, they decided to adopt those ways of thinking because they thought this is what would bring them into modernity and make them modern and enable them to fight against the British and resist the British. And then over time, they actually started believing these ideas. But if you look at early writings from 1860s, you can see that some of them are making a conscious decision to say, yes, this is beautiful poetry, but it's not going to help us in present day. We should, like Wordsworth, write, one of them says, we should, like Wordsworth, write about nature and social reform, and that will help us to be modern. This poetry is not going to help us in that regard. Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah, so I'm going to come to your next book, your book Love Right, Same-Sex Marriage in India. This is the first book to examine the same-sex marriages and same-sex. I also heard about the word suicides reported in India over the last 2 decades. So you've
Yeah.
examined these cases in the context of a wide variety of same-sex unions, right? From 14th century narratives about co-wives who miraculously produce a child together. I mean, we just talked about that. To 19th century depictions of ritualized unions between women, to marriages between gay men and lesbians arranged over the internet. I mean, tell us more. Like, what inspired you first of all to write this, and where did you find that information?
Okay, yes, it is the first and only book on the subject. Still the only book. How did I get the idea of why did I want to write about it? In 1980, when I was in my college hostel and I opened a newspaper, it was a tabloid called Blitz, and the first page had this picture. And those were the first gay Indians I saw. They were not activists, they were not leaders, and there was no movement at the time. And the picture was of these two young women, Malika and Lalitambika, who had tied their hands together and jumped into the channel in Kerala. And they had first suicide note. And their love letters to each other. So from 1980 to the present, these reports have been coming out of these young couples, mostly female, not all female, but mostly female, who have in all parts of the country been either getting married by religious rites or committing joint suicide, or both. Sometimes they perform the ritual first and then commit suicide. And the most interesting thing about them for me was that these were not English speaking. They were low income group. They had no contact with any movement. Most of them knew no word like lesbian or gay or homosexual or anything of that kind. They just knew that they loved each other, and their way of declaring that love as more than friendship was to say that we want to marry each other. Then they faced family disapproval usually, and often police interference. And mostly they were forced to separate, and very often they committed joint suicide. And there must be many who were forced to separate without committing joint suicide and were forced into marriages with men, right? But some of them were also married, widowed, divorced women who were getting together. And most interestingly, in some cases, the families actually finally agreed to the marriage. And you can now show the Vetka Milka. Now, this is an example. The first gay marriage, the first same-sex marriage that I ever came across in the press, Indian press, was in 1987. And this was of Leela Namdev and Urmila Srivastava, two women, police women, at the lower level of police women, not English speaking, in Madhya Pradesh. Okay, and they got married in a temple, and then the police promptly suspended them from the force. So they went back to Urmila's village. But there, Urmila's family, to console the women, they held a wedding reception for them. And this made national headlines in India. Journalists went to the village and interviewed them, and very interestingly, they interviewed one of their neighbors, who was a village school teacher, woman, Sushila Bhavasar. And she said, well, marriage is a union of souls. Where in the scriptures is it said that it has to be only between a man and a woman? And that was a remarkable statement by a very ordinary, not very highly educated woman. So I was most interested in two things. Why did these women over time, and there are hundreds of them that I have listed in the recent edition of this book, which has just come out last month. So I put a new list of the couples and also a new preface. So why did these women choose the language of marriage and of death and not some other kind of language? And why did some families accept it and agree and participate in the marriages? So, for instance, two young nurses in 2001, Jaya and Tanuja, they again from different communities, Jaya Chauhan and Tanuja Verma, they were married in a goddess temple in Bihar, and 200 guests attended the marriage, and Jaya's entire family participated. Jaya's sister married a man in the same ceremony. It was a double wedding ceremony. So that's the level of acceptance. After that, though, they went to get the marriage registered to the government registrar of marriages, who said, no, this is not possible. You can have any ceremony you like, but the government doesn't recognize it. Now, they had no rights, and the landlord, very soon, of their apartment asked them to get out of the apartment. Right? So what happens is that if after these marriages do take place, in many cases, journalists don't often follow up, but in many cases, the women basically are so socially isolated, and these are not very educated, not highly employed, high-earning women, and they don't have resources beyond their network, their kinship and local network. Once they're excluded from that, they're extremely isolated, and very often they separate. There's a sad story about one couple where one woman is an auto rickshaw driver, and once they got married and lived together, they had a child who was 2 years old, and the other woman, who was the biological mother, committed suicide. Now, her family came back into the picture, who had totally left her alone and wanted that child, saying it's our flesh and blood. And there was a civil rights organization which came to the defense of the other woman and said, if this was a man and woman, obviously she would be the parent of the child. So she's raising the child. Why should you come into the picture now? So I don't know what happened in that case. But this is the way in which many of these women have tried to get rights. And the most that they have got is when produced in court, and this is from early, not even while Section 377 was still there. When produced in the courts always said they are two adults. If they want to live together, they have a right to live together. That's all the court can do for them. But they don't get any other rights. Now, I should mention that in India, there are also many cross-sex couples, male-female couples, who commit joint suicide together, who run away and get married, who face a lot of social disapproval, sometimes even get murdered. But the difference is that once they do get married, the marriage is legally recognized. They have a legal status, the government can protect them. The same-sex couples have no such protection and no such rights. Yeah. So, but my main point here is that the demand for marriage much preceded the demand for marriage equality. That movement for marriage equality was pretty much unknown even in 1980. There was no such movement even in the West, and certainly not in India. There was no LGBT movement in India in 1987, really. So the demand for marriage equality is a demand which comes from people's own lived experience. And I said most of them are women, but there are also men. There's a couple of there's men who committed joint suicide too, because the family, the village harassed them so much. So these are people unconnected with each other, unconnected with any movement, who want marriage. And marriage is the language that is understood. If you say we want to get married, it's taken seriously. If you say she's just my friend, they will say, well, then why can't you marry a man and continue this friendship? No. So that is why they choose that language. And then I also examine the language of death. Why joint suicide? Which is really an Asian phenomenon. It's not a European present-day phenomenon so much. Committing joint suicide is a type of marriage, and that one gets from the suicide notes that these women left. Many women over time left these suicide notes saying, we can't be married in this world, we will be married in the next life, in the next world, in the next birth. They use various languages. Then I also interviewed some of the priests, Hindu priests who performed these marriages. I interviewed, and other people also interviewed, other journalists. So I interviewed a Shaiva priest who married two Tamil Brahmin women in Seattle in 2002. And he said, well, I had never come across when I was asked to do this, I had never thought about it. But I thought about it. I knew I will get criticism and many priests will disagree with me in my lineage. But I thought about it and I said the spirit has, according to Hindu text, spirit is not male or female. So if these two spirits are drawn to each other, like what is wrong with that? So it's exactly the same explanation that village woman gave, which shows that there is a general understanding, I think in most religions, that the spirit is not male or female. Second point is that of rebirth, which is, of course, unique to the four Indic religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. And this was brought up by many of the women themselves, and also brought up by priests. In 1977, Shakuntala Devi, who wrote one of the earliest book, perhaps, called The World of Homosexuals, she was a famous mathematician. She interviewed Sri Raghavacharya, who was the head of the famous Vaishnava temple at Srirangam. And he said, look, if these people are so drawn to each other that despite all the social disapproval, they insist on being together, it means that they are attached from a previous birth. And sex may change from birth to birth, but the attachment doesn't change, which is philosophically very correct in all these four religions philosophies. And even Indians who are not, who don't believe in rebirth as such, say Muslims and Christians, are very familiar with the idea. The idea is an Indic idea, and it's even playfully and jokingly used. I've heard Muslims also use this jokingly to say, "Oh, I got this. I don't deserve it. Must be from something I did in the previous birth." So, right. So it's an understood language and understood idea, but also a serious philosophical idea. I interviewed Swami Bodhananda. Now, he performed one of the earliest upper-class marriages. Today, we hear a lot about these upper-class celebrity marriages, which leads people to think, oh, it's a Western import. But it's not a Western import. The first pioneers of marriage are these ordinary female couples who had nothing to do with the West, who didn't even know English. But this is one of the early marriages that is an upper-class marriage with family support of these two men. And I interviewed him at length for my book. And he said, look, all relationships are the same. They all have the same problems. It's not different. And secondly, if the two are drawn to each other, it must be from attachment from a previous birth. And the two want to live together, they have to have the blessings of God, of parents, of elders. So I recited some verses from the Upanishad. He performed, he officiated at a Hindu ceremony. And that was the explanation that he gave. So yeah, so that's what the book is about. And you had said, okay, so let's go on.
Yeah, no, so I'm just trying to think that I'm trying to understand. So in one of the chapters is about his spirit gender, right? You pointed that out. So Atma ka Milan, meeting of souls. So why do families and society find it so hard to accept such a union? I mean, what's holding us back?
I wanted to add one thing, that the girls, these female couples, and I say girls because they're very young, most of them, they are Hindus, a lot of Christians, a few Muslims, Dalits, tribals, what is called caste, cross, all of that, many of them. Many are from the same community, but many also cross community. When we said, there's another interesting story of two tribal women, again, poor daily laborers from Assam, Bodo tribal women, Tingring and Roynati, who were publicly whipped in their village when they got married. They had to move from village to village. And finally, they found a village which accepted them. And they married in 1999. And in 2012, they were together still. And I think even later, they were together still. They are totally accepted as a married couple there. And very interestingly, when the state elections took place, the villagers actually told the candidates, please give their marriage a legal status. We want them to have protection. Okay, so there is acceptance by some families and some communities, and increasingly, and especially middle and up. Now, why do families not accept it? That's nothing uniquely Indian. Everywhere in the world, I think the first reaction of a heterosexual family, a father and mother, is going to be not thrilled if you're going to have a same-sex marriage. They are not there. The range of disapproval can vary. It can be a little, it can be a lot, but they're not going to be thrilled. And even after they accept it, they don't usually give it the same status as they would to a cross-sex. I mean, they don't think of it in exactly the same way. There can be exceptions, but mostly, I would say, and I don't think that's at all Indian. I think that's everywhere in the world. And that is because we are all raised with heterosexism, because heterosexuals, as defined, heterosexuality is a modern invention, really. The idea in ancient societies, the idea was anyone can be attracted to anyone, whether it was ancient Greece or ancient China or ancient India. The idea was not that you're attracted by gender. The idea was that you marry the other gender in order to have children. But you can be attracted to anyone who is young and beautiful, yeah? So that was at least the ancient Greek idea. So, but now that we've invented the idea of heterosexuals, heterosexism is the air we breathe, like many other prejudices, but I think very strongly entrenched. And so all of us, including gay people or however you define yourself, it does have that. You can't get it entirely out of your consciousness. I've even noticed it for myself that when I come across somebody I don't know and they're wearing a wedding ring, I assume they are married. The woman is married to a man. It may not be the case. If she doesn't look like the stereotype of a lesbian in the West I'm talking about, I assume she's married to a man. And that's a wrong assumption, right? So that's the reason, yeah.
Interesting. See, in our modern world, in the urban parts of India, when I wanted to come out, I said I think I'm a lesbian. I use that word. I know my friends will say I'm gay or I'm a queer. But what happens in the parts of India, and I'm talking about India, parts of India where these words don't mean anything, right? So how do they come out to their families? How do they?
Well, as I said, they usually come out by saying, I want to get married to her. It's usually in the context or him. It's usually in the context of a relationship. It's not about individual identity. And for this, I would say there's a larger point about Indian culture from studying the past as well. That Indians tend to define themselves, and maybe this is in other parts of the world, to define themselves in relation to others. I used to ask my Indian students to write an essay on myself, and it would always start with, my father is this, my mother is this, I have so many brothers, so many sisters. It's whereas in the West, often it will be my predilections. I like this, I like that. So the individual identity is embedded in kinship and community and is shaped by that. Okay, so you don't declare an individual identity by saying I'm gay, I'm lesbian. And nobody will understand that, as you said. You declare it by saying this is the person I want to marry and I'm going to marry. That is something that everyone understands, right? So that is the way it's coming out. Is not the phrase in Indian languages, but that is the way of declaring what you want to do and what effects does it actually have. If you just say you're gay, in fact, I know many middle class people who said they're gay, and the parents said, "Oh, you can anyway get married to a woman, and you will be, you will. How do you know you're gay?" But if you have they're not so worried about it. But if you have an actual relationship, they have to take it seriously. There's another person involved, and another family therefore involved. Two families are involved, right? So then that is has a certain impact, and particular. I think that is the primary way in which it is declared by people in villages and small town, non-English speaking people, I should say. Yeah.
Sure. Interesting, because I also want to know about the reporting. You got a lot of your information from various stories on from the newspapers, right? So how was it reported? Did they give facts that two women or two men were marrying, or did they give an opinion? And if they did give an opinion, was it skewed toward positive or negative? Because I was trying to find those kind of articles online.
I have collected them from 1980 onwards. Now it's online, but at that time it was just on paper, in the press, and it's not online. So yes, they gave opinions as well. Very often the headlines: lesbian marriage in quotation marks. Now, of course, it wasn't a legal marriage, so it could mean that, but also there's some doubt being cast on whether it's a marriage. But overall, I would say, with some exceptions, and in the Hindi press, I haven't made a deep study in Hindi press, but I have some Hindi press reports, and it could happen in all the languages. There was a mixed series of attitudes, but the Indian press overall tends to be, I think it's the legacy of nationalism, very sympathetic to what they see as anyone who's an oppressed group. So these poor young girls who are wanting to get married and live together, they are low income, they tend to be sympathetic to them. And that has increased over time, of course, as the LGBT movement came up. The press has become more and more supportive. So yeah, I would say it's not a bad portrayal overall. Of course, there are exceptions to that. And also, I knew some of these young women. I mean, some of these couples who wrote to me now, middle class. One was a doctor and a health worker from Bombay who ran away to Delhi. One of the Christian girl had a police officer father who chased her, and there was a lot of violence, and they took shelter in the house of two lesbians who were running an organization in Delhi. There's very few places that you can take shelter. And after a lot of drama, they finally managed to get jobs in Delhi and to settle down in Delhi, but they felt tremendously socially isolated. And finally, they broke up. Again, they disappeared from my ken, and I recently discovered that they finally broke up. One migrated to Australia, and the other, I don't know what she did. So, yeah.
So we hear about a lot of conversion therapies in India, right? In medical interventions, religious interventions. So did you find that through your research as well?
Not at the time. These are relatively new ideas. This conversion therapy or whatever kind is a relatively new idea, again imported from the West, basically. There's no such thing in Indian medical texts and legal. I've looked at ancient Indian medical and legal texts, which are very aware of, both Hindu and Jain actually are very aware of different genders and different types of desire and so on. This is first century I'm talking about. But no, there's no such thing as trying to convert people. So that's a relatively recent idea, and I haven't come across it in the reports. And most of these girls are so poor, their families don't know anything about conversion therapy. Their idea of conversion therapy is to beat them up or to say, no, why don't you get married to a man? How do you know this is it? To argue with that, basically. And to say it's illegal and to call the police and say that one woman has kidnapped the other, or the older woman has kidnapped the younger, and so on. Or to change the age of their daughter and say she's a minor, and so on. So those are the methods that they use. Conversion therapy is a very middle class English speaking, maybe Hindi speaking too, but middle class kind of phenomenon. It was not there in the case of these young women. And this I should say, this continues till date. The 2018, two women, Asha Thakur and Bhavna Thakur in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, jumped into the Sabarmati river and drowned themselves. And they left a suicide note written in lipstick, which I gave you on a paper plate, in which they said that the world does not allow us to be together. We will be together in the next world, in the next life. So it's continuing till date. In 2019, two young women, very young women, went to Varanasi temple, and they, without a priest, they got married to each other, which is one of the Hindu forms of marriage. They garlanded each other. And the sketch on the cover of Love's Right of the new edition is based on a photograph of them. One is putting sindoor in the other. They put sindoor in the hair of both. So, and I'm sure they are so young. I'm sure their families, I don't know, but I'm very likely that their families separated them, because they're not earning, they wouldn't have, but they were trying to make a statement. Marriage is a public statement to say that this is what we want and this is what we're doing. Yeah.
Gosh. So you yourself had a marriage by religious rites, right, in 2000, and then legal marriage in 2013. So how was it for you? If I may ask this personal question, of course, and did you have any kind of issues with the family, society at large? 2000 is a long time ago. Right.
Yeah, like any family, they were not happy about it. They had accepted my partner. We were together before that, and they were fine with that because they knew about me from much before that. So they had accepted her, and they said, "Well, we've accepted her. Everyone is inviting us. Why do you have to make it a marriage? Just continue like this." And we had a reception at the India International Center in Delhi, and they were upset about that because they thought their relatives, friends, etc., will come to know. But then over time, they had, I mean, basically families have no choice except but to accept it, depending on the situation, right? So since I was independent, and then after that, my parents stayed with us in the US, and of course they saw a different range of attitudes here. So my mother, even in the US, had introduced Mona as her daughter-in-law at times, and they stayed with us. My mother lived with us for the last 6 years of her life. Before that, my mother and father also lived with us for a couple of years. And then I was constantly, when they were in India, I was constantly calling every day, etc., because it was very worrying to be so far away. Yeah, and I don't think this story is at all unique. I think for the middle class, English-speaking middle class, that's very often the trajectory. Yeah, from initial disapproval, and they're not going to get violent in this kind of a family, from initial disapproval to, acceptance because there's not much choice.
Yeah, but there is a initial disapproval, right, in families. That is the thing. But
mostly,
again, like
there are exceptions, but mostly
that happens, right? And so if you're married in the US and then you travel to India, which I'm sure you do often, which we do often as well, and suddenly our status changes because India doesn't recognize same-sex marriages. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's okay. Some of the cases that are filed in the Supreme Court for marriage equality, Indian Supreme Court for marriage equality, have raised at least one of the cases has raised precisely that if a man and a woman marry, an Indian man and a foreign woman, then overnight, even if they have that's the first time they've seen each other, overnight the foreign woman gets a right to apply for an overseas citizenship of India, and then can live in India for any amount of time, can work, can get can open a bank account and so on. Whereas if it's a same-sex couple, even if you've been together 20 years or 40 years or whatever, the person is a legal stranger to you when you're in India, which can be dangerous because if you fall ill, if you die, your birth family is the next of kin. This person is not recognized at all, your spouse. And also, the person can be in India only for 6 months at a time under a tourist visa. So I know a couple who are living in India who have children as well, and one of them is American, and so they've lived there now for, I don't know, at least 8-10 years and in India, but every 6 months he has to go out of the country and be out for a few days and come back, he was carrying on that way. But when the coronavirus happened, he was in England and he has been stuck there for 1.5 years, hasn't seen the children except on Zoom or the spouse. And because now, if you had an OCI, you are allowed back into India now. But if you have a tourist visa, it's still close to tourist visa. So those are the sorts of completely unnecessary and unfair problems that are faced with by same-sex couples of a certain class. Now, as far as the poor are concerned, I should say many of them never register their marriages, male, female, or any kind. So what they want is mainly the acceptance of the local community and family. Yeah, but there are certain rights that the government gives you, and for middle class couples, that goes, and for everybody to some extent, those rights matter. Getting a visa, getting a passport, getting be recognized as a child's parent in school, getting all of the rights that you get, getting inheriting the pension of the other person, in medical, being on their medical insurance, getting a housing loan together,
Right.
being able to rent or buy property together. All of these, if you're an Indian couple in India, still you are deprived of all these rights. You are treated as just two friends. So yeah.
Yeah, but things should change. No, I hope it changes because we've had a situation, Nicola and I, where Nicola was in the hospital here in the UK. Even in the UK, I had difficulty, and every
Really?
day, yeah, here as well because we're not married, but
Oh,
we've
you're
been
not
together a
married.
long. We're not married, but we
You
are.
can be. So
Yeah, and we
it's a
have that
choice.
choice. Yeah,
That's the thing. Now, if you
yeah,
choose, if the right is there, but you choose not to marry, that's a different matter. But in India, you don't have that right. That option is not available. There's a special
exactly.
marriage act in India under which any two people can marry, or regardless of religion and background. So that is the act under which a same-sex couple, if they could marry, would have that option. Now, if you choose not to get married, then of course you won't get the rights of a married couple,
No,
right?
exactly. But but that medical situation actually compelled us to now think about marriage because
Right.
for exactly for all the things you said, we lived in India for a couple of years with our children, and
Mhm.
I couldn't put Nicola's name on the admission forms, for instance, of the children. She had to be an emergency contact. They just would refuse. Insurance
Interestingly,
policy.
interestingly, that experience varies because private schools in India, I won't go into details of who and so on, have accepted, many of them just accept and put down the other person as a parent. They don't go and check with the government, they just put down it as a parent. Interestingly, ordinary Indians, middle class Indians, as long as it's not coming to their own family, as neighbors, as colleagues, and so on, they are, my experience is that they are mostly all fine. I have never faced any. I mean, if you are comfortable, confident, and so on, mostly they are all fine. I'm sure there are many exceptions, but mostly they are all fine. But it's when it comes into their own family that they would get
Yeah.
upset.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, because we've had both kinds of experiences where people have been very accepting and people have been very abusive as well. And strangers have been abusive
Yeah.
to us. And I've a whole story around that in New Zealand, that too in New Zealand. But
Hmm,
yeah,
New Zealand, that makes more sense.
yeah.
India, in India too, it's happened too.
No, India has been very,
Right,
so
exactly.
India is unique actually. Unique. Either they will
Well,
be friendly and they'll accept.
we're used to so many variations.
Yeah.
There is the true diversity there because even within the same religion, there are so many variations, so many sects doing so many strange things. Somebody is who eats meat doesn't eat meat on Monday and Wednesday. Who knows why? And some different communities are doing a whole range of things. So we grew up absolutely used to the fact that your family does something which seems strange, but it's not really strange. My family is also doing strange things. So everybody you're used to that range of
Yeah.
behavior from the
Yeah.
start. Yeah.
I agree. I think, like I said, India is unique that they're very accepting. Most are accepting exactly for the reasons you mentioned. But if they don't like something, they will
Hmm.
ghost you. That's the new thing, right? Ghost you. They will just deny, they will disappear, they will just run away, they will not acknowledge you. And that is the other way they respond. So we've had people who have ghosted us, and that's okay. But most people have been very accepting. So do you think it's harder for women of the same sex than for gay men? I mean, it's a question I ask myself because a lot of my friends come out to us and say, gosh, this is so difficult. My parents won't accept me. My friends are just they're saying, just pretend, get married, live a double life. What's your problem? So do you think it is harder for women in India?
One can't generalize. It depends on the family. It depends on the community. It varies very widely, village to village, even family to family. But I would say that why are so many of these female couples who run away? Why are so many of them female and so few of them male? And there, I would say that in that lower income class, which is non-English speaking, men. It's much easier for men to live a double life. They can have a wife and have children, which satisfies their parents. And this is an old thing; it's nothing new. The difference is that in the past you could openly have a relationship outside marriage. Now you have to secretly do it. So that there's a pressure there. But for men, they spend so much of their time anyway in the public sphere. They don't sit at home every moment that they are free. So they are out a lot of the time. What they are doing, as the Kama Sutra says, who knows when, where, and why, what they are doing. But for women, it's much more difficult. Women of that class are much more monitored. They can't travel as easily alone. They can't meet unknown people alone. They can't meet unknown men or women alone, unless that person is accepted as a family friend, as a relative. So women's relationships, they can lead a double life, and they do. But those relationships will be in the family and kinship network and hidden again But it's more difficult in the domestic sphere because you can be caught more easily than if you're a man meeting somebody in his apartment somewhere else, right? So that may be one reason, and the other reason may be that I don't want to generalize about men and women or any. These young women, at least certainly from the data that I have, they more women don't want to just have sex, and they want to marriage. They want to live with another the person who's not just a lover but a friend. Many of them say they're very close friends. They were friends from childhood. They were in love since they were young girls, and that's what they want. And some men want that too, but perhaps more women want it. I can't generalize on that basis, but from the data I have, that's what it appears to be for this set of people, not for the upper middle class or the English speaking. That's a different situation. Yeah.
Sure, sure. So we've lived in different parts of the world, right? You and us. So experiences are different. I've lived in India. I feel that when I'm in India, while I can be who I want to be, but around my relationship, around my ecosystem with Nicola, I find it's a little bit more stifling. I can't just openly go and say this is my partner. They always assume that it's your business partner. They always until you come out and you tell them, no, this is my life partner. So do you think it is free? And again, I'm asking you to generalize, and I'm sorry to do that, but do you think it is freer for us here, where we live in the US and the UK, versus India, and even urban India I'm talking about, not just, the
Well,
small
it's
town.
freer because the rights have now been finally, after so much time, the rights have been accepted. We have civil rights in the West now. Right to marry, right against discrimination, right? The rights are accepted, especially the right to marry is, I think, a very important one. So once those rights are accepted, then obviously it's freer. It doesn't mean that you won't face disapproval here. There's a lot of hate crime and there's a lot of hate speech in the US for sure. But and in India, despite it's not legal and you don't have the civil rights, so that's why it's less free, right? But on the other hand, experience varies, and if someone introduces someone as their spouse, usually in polite English speaking society or even Hindi speaking society, you will not be they won't say nasty things to your face. They might behind your back, but they won't say it to your face. And there's a lot of support as well. There's a movement, there's an active movement, and people know now. They don't. It's not that they don't know about it. There's that wonderful recent film, Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, which depicts it. So every now a lot of people do know. It's not something completely unknown to them or new to them. And I have found that very ordinary Hindi-speaking people are happy to look at wedding pictures. They don't ask questions. They're happy. They accept it that they've seen you year after year. They've seen a couple with a child or with children, and they accept it. It's not discussed. You don't go and make a statement to them, and neither do they make a statement to you. So, but I'm sure it varies very widely. And within the family, of course, it's a different thing. Within the family, families can be, they have a whole different set of things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, it is again my own experience, my family, 20 years of me being out but not being out, and
Mm.
I finally made it public. My own family, I have family in Mangalore, which is South India, and my mother's side and my father's side completely accepted us. They
So
they just and
so there you
and
are. Despite being
yeah,
Catholic and everything, they did. And
yes.
I have Catholic friends in India, neighbors who are completely, I mean, we're very friendly, and they're, yeah, completely fine. And it's never been discussed, but they have told. So yeah.
So
And
I think
that is my experience. That overall, with important exceptions, but overall in the middle class and upper middle class, regardless of religion and so on and so on, people do sort of take it in their stride when it's not in their own immediate family, when it's not their own children. Yeah.
correct. So I think majority are very open to it. I mean, Nicola and I've traveled to places like Jharkhand, Ranchi. We've done our book events there, and I've had people from really, like exactly what you said, from rural parts of India come and touch my feet and say, "Thank you for giving us hope. Thank you, my child is this," and I think I can see through you that they can have a normal life,
Yeah.
basically, which is the fear that most parents have, that you can.
My
The biggest
co-editor
fear,
for Sense Love in India, Salim
yeah.
Kidwai, is a Muslim, and he had long ago a Hindu boy come and touch his feet in a disco or somewhere, and say that by giving me contact with my own history, so it's like things that he knows now, things that he didn't know before. So yeah.
We need more people like you to write books so that we can really, because that is how the narrative changes, right? And I'm going to. Is it available on Amazon or not every Snapdeal
Book.
places, other places? Your books
They're all on Amazon, I think.
and
On
also
Amazon, yeah. Everything.
Kindle version is also available these days. People also
For some
use.
of the books. The novel is, I think, an ebook. I'm not sure about all the others. Love's Right should be an ebook. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not absolutely sure because Amazon UK is also a different thing from Amazon
Sure,
US.
sure. Also, I want you to know for people from other parts of India, are the books available in different translations as well?
The novel I've just finished translating, and that will come out in Hindi. The others, Same-Sex Love in India, somebody's working on it. It'll take a very long time because it's from 15 languages. So you have to translate from 15 languages into Hindi. So that's going to take a long time. But the others are not translated. Okay.
Okay, it would be great for us to get more of the translated versions as well, right? Because, like I said, that's how the narrative will change. And thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. You say, I mean, I don't really normally ask for messages, but you have so much richness in your conversation. Is there anything you want to say to our audience?
Well, it's just to say that if you study history, the pleasure of that is to discover that things have changed tremendously over time. Not always in a positive direction, often in a negative direction, what you might consider a negative direction. But the fact that it changes is the most important thing. Because if it changes, that means it is possible to change again. It will change again. And that's a basic principle of Hindu philosophy and of science, that everything is changing all the time, whether you can see it or not. So that's a very hopeful thought. That just and movements, of course, play a very important role. But I think just people living their lives plays, like these young women, just living their lives plays an equally, maybe even more important role in bringing about change. Just people living their lives, and then you get used to seeing that things you were frightened of, and you see it is not frightening. So
Yeah, exactly. And there are many things you said, and I've read about you quite a bit. And what stayed with me, is these lines that I want to read out. It's difficult to remember the past and easy to forget it or misunderstand it. That is why it is important for gay people in particular to preserve their diaries and letters so that readers in future will have a record of reality. And I think this is it for me. I believe in stories. I believe in changing narratives. And Nicola and I started something called Coming Out Stories from India quite recently. We've had so many Indians, young from 20-year-olds to, we're talking about people who've started the movement in India on that story. They're sharing their stories. And I'm so hoping that your books, these stories, they stay on forever and they help collectively in the journeys of, paving the future for our next generation of LGBTQI.
thank you. The
So
internet
thank you.
helps tremendously with that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for your time today. And audience, thank you for watching Today with Totally Out Now, presented by The Views Room. For any questions, feedback, please write to us at theviewsroom@gmail.com. See you next time. And thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much again. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.